Hello, everyone, and hello to our folks joining us on Zoom. We're glad you could join us here today for the Mapping Tahlequah History Workshop. We are so excited and honored to hear from Dr. Brenden Rensink. I've known Brenden for several years now, and his work has been inspirational for me as I've seen his Intermountain Histories, a digital mapping project that looks at the region. Intermountain includes areas like Utah, I think Wyoming, Colorado, and he's worked with students and different collaborators, colleagues from his own university where he works, Brigham Young University in Provo, Utah. And he is the associate director of the Charles Redd Center for Western Studies there. And that's where I had my first major connections with Brenden. Dr. Rensink was, I had worked with the Redd Center and his predecessor, Jesse Embry, who is a hardcore oral historian, has done a lot of oral history work. As I mentioned with you all, I love oral history. The stories is what really drew me into history. And so Brenden followed Jesse, and the Redd Center has been a wonderful support in my life and my work. And they are very fortunate to now have Brenden there, who's done all kinds of projects with them. He started a podcast there featuring Western American history. He had his first book come out while you were there, right? Native but Foreign, and an award-winning book looking at Indigenous peoples and working with Indigenous peoples who have been considered, I'm not going to delve into a book here, but considered, the title of the book, Foreign on Their Own Lands and Migrations and Movements for Diverse Indigenous Peoples. And then at the Redd Center, he's also been an editor and a key drive behind different collaborations of volumes, herding cats, as I call it, when you have a lot of different scholars and works and having workshops with them, supporting all their work, and getting their work published. And I was glad to be a part of a collaboration looking at American Indians and Mormon history that the Redd Center held. So he's doing all kinds of projects, has a lot of service in different organizations that he's involved in, like the Western History Association, where I connected with him, and a BYU slavery project that is interrogating and looking at BYU's entanglements with histories of slavery, very similar to what we're seeing other campuses and universities doing, like Georgetown University. So it's great that Brenden could join us because he's been a mastermind, as I'll say, of digital humanities projects, really thinking innovatively about history and how to engage the public, so that it's not just seen as histories for this exclusive group, but how can we really make it accessible, engage different communities and people, and doing that with all kinds of technologies like podcasts, interactive websites, and in our teaching as higher ed. As I said, he not only works with his own students, but he's been supporting other faculty at different universities to contribute to Intermountain history. So I recommend check out their website. It was a really strong guide for John and I as we were comparing and thinking about, what was possible, what could we do? And so that's why we thought, we definitely need to ask Brenden as our inaugural Mapping Tahlequah History Workshop speaker to come in, and appreciate him making all the way from Utah in the rain with us today. So we are glad to have you, Brenden, and look forward to hearing from you of reconnecting the public with their past through digital history. And without further ado, it looks like we're good to go. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Farina. And thanks to everyone here. And I think there's a few people hiding online as well.
Yeah.
I'm really grateful to be here. Grateful for the opportunity to speak and to participate in this workshop and hear more about some of the projects that you guys are working on here. I'm not going to offer technology advice about doing digital history. That's not my expertise. And there's lots of groups and online forums, very tech savvy people, and it sounds like already here on campus. I think the tech stuff you guys have covered. But instead, what I want to do is talk about some philosophical and practical issues to think about or to kind of grapple with as you think about engaging in digital history work or public history work. And I'm hoping I can provide some guideposts or warning signs, some things I've learned as I've stumbled along trying to do what is very challenging work, and I argue what should be very challenging work, engaging with the public. It's not easy. It's more complex than we generally assume. So, and when I get to the end, I'll close by sharing kind of a more detailed history of this Intermountain Histories project that I've been working on, and kind of walk you through the process I've used, and maybe that'll be of some value. So first, I just want to acknowledge that digital history is much more than just throwing some stuff up online and calling it a day, or it can and should be more than that. And public history should be a lot more than just trying to crack people's skulls open and shovel in a bunch of information that we think they would benefit from. And also, I use this term reconnecting the public. I don't want to imply that the public's wholly forgotten their pasts. But sometimes historical knowledge is generational. And most communities have an issue as generations pass, as people move. We're an increasingly mobile nation. Maintaining community knowledge can be a challenge, having consistency in that. So I want to try to present some ways in which I think digital public history projects are really valuable in establishing a foundation of easily accessible knowledge that generations of people of the public can benefit from, but also people moving in and out of communities can benefit from. All right, now I got to run 2 different computers here as I switch slides. Let's see if you can.
Putting you to the task.
Hey, look at that. All right. Farina already told you quite a bit about me, so I don't need to go too much more. But I published a few books. Farina has a chapter in this volume. This is the monograph I published a few years back. And I have this new edited volume coming out this fall that I'm pretty excited about. I've also, co-edited or co-wrote these books and lots of other articles and book chapters that we don't need to talk about. And then, of course, we're going to talk quite a bit today about the Intermountain Histories project that I run. I also run a monthly podcast where I interview authors or writers who write about the American West. So if after today you're like, I like the sound of that guy's voice, I really could use some more of that. You can do it for about an hour a month. So I want to start actually by sharing 2 quick stories from work in the archives to identify some problems that communities may face with digital history projects, and then to identify problems that digital history projects can solve, but then also to identify an example of a problem that digital history projects can create. Just as kind of an intro to get our brains moving. Public history is a term that not everyone is familiar with. The National Council on Public History, NCTH, is kind of the National Organization for Public History. They define public history as such. It describes the many diverse ways in which history is put to work in the world. So real world applications of historical knowledge. And this is being done by academics, museum professionals, historical consultants, government historians, archivists, oral historians. There's all kinds of people that are engaged in this kind of public history work. So taking our knowledge, our expertise in historical methodology, and then applying it to directly benefit and engage with the public. What about digital history? Well, early on, and even maybe still today, I think a lot of people are not entirely sure what this means. And it's more than just digitizing sources. When I've told people, oh, I'm working on some digital history stuff, the assumption is, oh, so are you like digitizing photos and documents and then making like an archive online, which can be an important component of a digital history project. But digital history also is about using digital tools to analyze data, to provide new ways to interpret and present data or historical sources of information in ways that we couldn't do just with paper. And there's all kinds of techie stuff and programs and applications people use to comb through immense amounts of data and come up to new conclusions through these digital means. Okay, so let me share two quick stories. But first, to highlight a problem that some communities have that digital history might help solve. In 2008, which almost 15 years ago, which is hard to believe, I was living in Lincoln, Nebraska, working on my dissertation that became my book, Native but Foreign. This is a book that looked at Native Americans crossing borders. And one of the challenges of the project was that, I was looking at natives who crossed borders into the United States and then fought to secure federal tribal recognition in the United States, a group from Canada and a group from Mexico, but both who had traditional longstanding ties across what became the borders. The problem that I faced was that most archives fail to catalog their records until after they're recognized. So you can go to the National Archives in DC, you can go to Record Group 75, and for federally recognized tribes, there's neatly organized archival structures of, collection number this and that is all of the Blackfeet records from the Blackfeet Agency or so forth. But the groups I was working with for the period I was working with them were not federally recognized. So this archival structure in which to put documents and stuff just didn't exist. The other problem being, though, that when these native peoples left Canada or left Mexico, they fell out of those archives. So Crees, for instance, one of the groups I work with, it's the largest indigenous group, First Nations group in Canada, and there's lots of great Cree histories, and often there might be a little footnote that says, oh, and in 1885, Big Bear's son, Little Bear, fled to Montana as a political refugee with some followers. And they just fall out of the historiography of Canadian First Nations Cree history. But since they weren't federally recognized here, they didn't fall into our archives. The records are just hard to find. So the project took a lot of digging. That's why I was very excited when I started coming across some footnotes that mentioned what we see here, that mentioned a Rocky Boy school archive, or a Chippewa Cree research project, something. I started finding a few little mentions, and I'm like, oh, amazing. At the reservation, they have an archive. So I reached out to the people I knew at the tribal college. They didn't know what I was talking about. I reached out to reservation officials and the tribal government. They didn't know what I was talking about. Eventually, they got me in contact with the principal of the school, who didn't know what I was talking about. And eventually someone said, in the basement, there's a kindergarten room in the basement, and there's a large storage closet adjoined to that room, and there's some file cabinets in there. Maybe that's this Rocky Boy School archive. So I said, okay, and that summer I drove to Montana. A janitor let me into the basement kindergarten room, and I opened it up, and it was like full of kindergarten supplies. So, an hour of removing stuff out to get back to these file cabinets that were buried. And I opened them up, and guess what? There it is. It was this archive. Back in the mid and late 70s, there was a research team that the tribe had that went around scouring the National Archives, University Archives, everything they could find to try to gather as many records as they could. They also conducted oral histories with elders and all kinds of really valuable things. So, why had it been forgotten about? Why was it buried in this kindergarten storage closet? I don't have a clear answer for that, but I suspect it has something to do with inertia, for lack of a better term. Healthy archives need to be used to stay healthy. And once they start being used, they start popping up in people's footnotes, like I found these few examples, and then other people see them and they go to the archive and they use it and it perpetuates. And this is how records become integrated into historiography. But with this group, because they weren't well known, because they didn't have clear records in the National Archives and in a lot of university archives, the snowball just didn't quite get rolling down the hill on getting the word out about this archive and these amazing resources. And they eventually kind of faded into obscurity. So what's my point? Digital history, if it had existed back in the late 1970s, in the forms we have today, could have been a powerful tool for this research team to not just collect all these things, but then to publicize them and make sure people knew about what they had, or to start providing interpretation and analysis online as well. After I went through I spent a few days there, and I spent the afternoon of the last day creating an inventory of everything that was in the file cabinets, and I gave that to the tribal government and to the people at the college, and they were really excited. They hadn't forgotten their history; they knew their history. But as a community, these amazing resources that have been collected have been somewhat forgotten. So digital history work can help provide communities access to resources that might otherwise, languish in dusty file cabinets, or worse, be in a box up in grandma's attic. And after she passes, and the grandkids don't know what to do with these boxes of random papers, get tossed. Kind of stuff that keeps archivists up at night. So digital history has the power to help us keep our remembrance of history active as generations pass and as community members move in and out. Okay, second story. To highlight a potential problem that digital public history work might actually create. During those same years working on my dissertation, but on the other border down in Arizona, I was looking at Yaquis who had crossed from Mexico and established communities throughout southern Arizona. And I was in Tucson working at the Arizona State Museum, looking at the Edward and Rosamond Spicer collection. He was an anthropologist there. The archive was actually closed to the public because of funding issues, but I sweet talked an archivist to convincing his bosses to let me in. So they let me in for almost a whole week and just sat me at a table back in the middle of the archive. It's like, here's your boxes on the shelf. Have a good week. And it was great. It was amazing. But towards the end, I was kind of finishing up, and I noticed on a different shelf there was another set of boxes that had the Spicer name on it. But I didn't see them in the catalog, and I asked, what are those? Like, oh, those are some uncatalogued boxes we just haven't had the time or money to go through yet. You're welcome to take a look at them. So I did. And I found in there a document that was a letter of recommendation that Edward Spicer, as a professor, had written for a student who I think was going on to grad school. And it was a name I recognized. It was a prominent community member who was then still alive. The problem, and it wasn't really central at all to the story I was trying to tell, or what I was trying to answer with my book. So this wasn't like a real moral quandary, but it was not a positive letter of recommendation. It was very negative. No, it didn't factor into my book. So I didn't need to wrestle with, oh, should I include this or not? But in that archive and in other archives, I did find things. For instance, there was this term torocoyores, which referred to Yaquis who had basically were traitors to their community, had like turned community members into immigration, or during the wars with Mexico had betrayed their countrymen in some way. And there were documents which named individuals that were considered traitors and family names that were considered traitors. Now this was kind of central to the questions that my book is trying to answer. So let's say I'm working on a digital history project and digitizing documents or doing some kind of project to make archival documents available to the public. What should I do with those kinds of documents?
Consider the source.
Well, yeah, consider the source. Yeah, because it may not be a reputable source. Let's say it even is the most reputable of sources. That family might still live in Arizona in the Yaqui community. Is it right for me to take a document from the archive and to, now, it's a public, okay, it was closed at the time, but it's a public archive. Anybody can go in and look through these things. So it wasn't a private document, but it was a very, very difficult to access document, some of these things. When we're doing digital history work, often we're taking quote unquote public archival resources or knowledge, public knowledge, but that's very difficult to access or just not known, and we're making it accessible. And we need to be very cautious about the kinds of materials that we do make public. There's some ethics involved. I don't think we should censor things because they make us uncomfortable. As historians, we wrestle with discomfort, we wrestle with thorny issues, but we need to consider the ramifications and weigh the value and risks of making digitally available resources that otherwise the public may not have easy access to. We see this, the American West Center at the University of Utah runs this really great project called Native Places. And this is a really excellent example of how they grapple with this. They've partnered with tribes, but they've given the tribes authority to decide, kind of like this project that you guys are working on has like a registered user login, right? The tribes for this project have access to toggle on and off what sites are available to the public. And so on the back end of this website, there are a lot more sites, including sacred sites and other things, which some tribes have clicked, private, don't make this layer of data available to the public. So kind of a good example of how one project is wrestling with this. So my point of these two archival stories, which don't have anything to do with digital history, but as I was looking back on my past research in light of my more recent digital work, is that it has tremendous potential, but it needs to be undertaken with care and with caution.
Professor, putting you on the spot, what was your decision?
I did not. I mean, I included some information about about the traders. I included information, but I didn't include names. And I could have expanded the book in that way, and it would have been really fascinating to trace these different families or individuals. But I decided, you know what, I can set that aside. Because sometimes, some things, I'm not a member of those communities, right? And so this is actually a question I continually came up on, saying, maybe this is not my story. Well, let's ask a few questions. This is a lot of text for a single slide. I apologize. That I want to try to walk through. What public needs can digital history project address? How do we discover what those public needs are or public interests? How do we define who our public is? Who's our audience? And how do we balance being directed by the public needs with our desire as the experts, supposedly, to kind of steering the public in what kind of information we're giving them? And then I want to talk about some risks or problems or just challenges that we might face in doing this work. So how do we discover what it is the public is interested in or wants? We might be tempted to think that the public they don't know what they need, right? We know better. Well, they may not know what historical information they would benefit from as a community. Maybe we do have a better view on that sometimes, but they definitely do know what they're interested in. And here's an example of some overlapping public needs and interests with some interests that I have personally as a historian that I'm really anxious to teach the public. So this is a map of the Wasatch Mountains right next to where I live. And the city of Provo and a group called Utah Valley Trail Association. I don't remember exactly what the acronym stands for. They're doing a bunch of new trail building there in the mountains. And there's different colors listing mountain bikes only, or here's an existing trail, proposed trail. Anyways. And the public is really, the trail using public is very interested in knowing where all the trails are what their best uses are and so forth. So here's kind of a public interest in mapping and in geography. But, and I look at these maps and my trail running brain, my hiking brain is trying to figure like, oh, I could link up that ridge line with that canyon over there. What kind of long, crazy routes could I go on a trail run for? And there's this public need for proper management of the landscape, of a multi-use landscape with hikers, bikers, equestrians, hunters, so forth. They may all have kind of conflicting priorities about how they use them, but this is a digital, not history, but a digital mapping resource that they are using. But here's the issue. My historian brain looks at that map and starts thinking about like, well, why are the trails there, right? Why was this trail built there? Why is this trail built there? And this is more than just me geeking out. I mean, if you look also like some of these fall, well, that map's not a good example. This is not just me geeking out over historical trails, because I also have an interest in environmental history. And I'm interested in this landscape today because we have a real public crisis along the Wasatch Front, which is water. And as an environmental historian, I think the public needs to have a better understanding of where their water comes from, the history of where their water has come from in the past, because we don't know if it'll be able to come from there in the future, as resources are literally drying up. And I want them to think actively about this. Now, when I look at that previous trail map, or sorry, that's a little bit washed out, I apologize. These are aerial photographs from back in the 1930s and 50s. Some of these same landscapes. And, oh man, you really can't see. I apologize. But you can see faintly on here, like here's a road, right? Hold on, wrong mouse. Sorry, I'm running too many things here. Here's a road. You can see, I don't know if you can tell really faintly right here. There's a little trail cut in the trees, right? Here's more. My question being, why are a lot of these roads here? Well, a lot of them, those roads and trail cuts that follow certain contours are there because of previous aqueduct projects, previous water infrastructure projects. There are a few places where you can still see the former the Smith family ditch, which runs along this terrace in Provo Canyon. This is this is a couple canyons over, but this is metal banding from what used to be a previous wooden aqueduct pipeline that ran out of Battle Creek over to the front range of the mountains. There's some more like old wreckage of it. Down in town, there's the Murdoch Canal, and this is what it used to look like with the canal. And there's a nice little running path along it. But now the entire thing is paved over. So a lot of the water infrastructure that was there, it's still there, but it's been buried. And the public is less and less aware of it. In the very moment that me as a historian, I'm convinced that they need to be more aware of it as we're really facing a water shortage, water crisis. This was, I was reminded of this just a couple years ago. This top left is a picture from my house. We had a huge wildfire. And this wildfire is on the exact hills that we were just looking at the maps and pictures of. And in one of the news notices from the city about this fire, which went on for a few days, there's this little note that said that city water engineers or someone went and checked on the Alta Springs, and everything is fine. And I think most of the public just like, what? And then they moved on past. But I knew that Alta Springs is a capped spring up in the mountains where we get some of our drinking water from. And it used to be very well known by the public because that aqueduct that brought the water down was visible, and people were just more aware of where their water came from. This is, I hiked up there a few weeks ago. You can see here, this is some plastic tubing this is all burnt, right? From the fire. But you can see here, this is just up on the cliffs. They have this whole thing because the water is just like dribbling and gushing out of the side of the mountain. Okay, well, what does this have to do with digital? That's an excellent question. So I feel a need as a historian that I want to train the public to better read their landscape, to better understand where their water comes from. And I think about digital mapping projects as like, that might be the most effective way to help the local public here understand, like, have historical context for the water crisis that we're now facing. But does the public want to know that? I don't know if they care. I mean, as the water dries up more and more, they'll start to care. But I see here, maybe there's a chance for some overlapping public needs or interests, and me as the historian with the expertise, what I want to teach them, right? And maybe the overlap is through, trail mapping projects, where maybe I could pursue a project that doesn't just map out the trails, but has historical information embedded in the map, teaching the public that, oh, this trail exists along this contour of the mountains, because that's where they're, by the way, underneath you, there's an aqueduct, or there used to be, or because there was this spring cap up there and they used to pipe it down to the set of fields or so forth. Maybe there's a chance there for me to combine a public need and interest, trails, with some historical analysis that I think would benefit. Well, this is a challenge. How do we do this? How do we figure out how to navigate this? We need to know who our public is. And this, we should say publics, plural, right? It could be just the general population. Is it students here or elsewhere at the university? We have to try to decide in our projects if we're serving one or all of these publics, that they may have very different priorities. How do we discover what their priorities and needs are? This is something that can be a real challenge because we have to listen, and that can be challenging. We need to find ways to find out what the public wants to know, what they want to understand. What resources did they wish they had access to? This might be easier if we're a long-time community member, but if we're a new arrival, that could be a real challenge. This is also a challenge because there's no consent. There'll be no consensus when we engage with the public. As we try to listen and find out what they need or want to know more about, we're going to get all kinds of different answers, and sometimes maybe directly conflicting answers. All communities are divided. I don't have an easy answer for navigating that, unfortunately. But we need to ask, we need to engage with the public, and we need to listen. So how then do we balance being directed by public needs, which is really a kind of a core, is a real foundation in public history, is listening to the public and having their questions kind of direct what we work on, as opposed to the opposite. But in that, we are going to be using our expertise to try to steer the public with our expertise. You have the expertise and knowledge as a researcher or the person running a project. You know what portions of your historical expertise would be of value to the general public and why, but it may not align at all with what the public is actually interested in. And so there often is overlap, like I'm thinking about with trails and water, but it may be a challenge to find that overlap and to figure out a way to build projects that the public will be interested in, but not just because they tell some interesting stories, but because they teach something that you as a historian or as a researcher think is really important, and you want to provide real analysis. And this is we want to elevate public understanding, but first we have to meet the public kind of where they are, in terms of topics, in terms of depth, in terms of the type of language we use. Are we filling all of our stuff with lots of academic-y jargon and $5 words that people need a thesaurus to understand? In terms of balancing narrative and storytelling, which is often what the public is going to latch onto the easiest, and balancing that with analysis and interpretation, it makes for very challenging writing. But I do believe there's a way to do this. Once we have to get to know our public, then we can meet their needs while kind of leading them along, maybe Trojan horsing in some nuanced historical analysis that without them realizing. We have to be good writers to do that. Another thing that this approaches is the issue that we need to share authority, which can be really hard for academics, whether we view ourselves as like sitting up in an ivory tower. We are in a tower. This isn't an ivory tower, but we're on the top floor, right? But whether we view ourselves that way or not, a lot of the public might view us as being somewhat aloof or kind of, elitist and snooty. And for a good reason, because more often than not, we kind of are quite often. Experts, not just in academia, but any kind of experts have trouble with sharing authority and valuing public knowledge, valuing public curiosities and interests alongside our own. So perhaps we might ask the initial framing questions to try to narrow the scope of what a digital public history project might be. But then we have to step back pretty quickly and listen and adapt as we learn from the public about what it is that they want to know, see what resonates with them, and then build from there and find ways to integrate in the things that we think are really important. Two possible solutions for this are to find community partners and collaborators. And the second, to be endlessly flexible in project goals, format, and form. To find community partners, and I'm excited to find out in the workshop about how you guys are going about this with mapping, the Mapping Tahlequah project. But you may consider forming advisory boards in varying forms of formality or informality, but bringing in some official community partners and collaborators to advise. Then you have to listen to them, though, and you have to talk to them. I help run this the BYU Slavery Project at Brigham Young University, and we have an advisory board, which Farina is a member of, and we almost never talk to our advisory board because we're all stressed to the max, and it's on a back burner, and like we're barely keeping the project going, and then like, oh my goodness, we haven't talked to the advisory board. So I apologize. But this highlights a problem, right? It's a lot easier in a way just to sit in your own office by yourself and run a project with no input. Because when you start bringing in other people and collaborators, scheduling becomes an issue. Everything gets more complicated. But there's power in that because it helps connect you to some of your stakeholders, right? People who might be interested in the project.
May I interrupt?
Yeah.
So how do you suggest that happens? How do you get public to comment on what you're doing? Put it out there on some web and say, this is where we're going. If you don't like it, tell me, or give me an attaboy if it's right.
Yeah, so I don't think there's an easy answer to this. This is a question that we need to ask probably before we start projects and launch them, and that we need to ask continually along the way, right? If working from a university that gives you kind of a built-in network of people who often already have connections with the public that you might pull from. I mean, I didn't even realize that, what's his name, the mayor?
Jason?
I mean,
Jason Nichols?
Like the mayor was. Yeah. I mean, it's crazy, right? I know that he teaches here as well, but yeah. So work out through the networks that already exist. You can also consider, starting and managing social media pages or groups as a way to start listening and finding people who might be interested in collaborating. Later, that could be really powerful for publicizing the work. But with social media comes a lot of challenges as well. I'll touch on a few of those in a minute. having official public partners can be really powerful. But with that, we need to be very flexible. Because what if initially you had the idea that this project is going to be X, Y, and Z, and then once you bring collaborators in from the public, you find out that's not going to work. That's not what they're interested in. We need to be willing to change the goals and scope of what we're working on. So as you're beginning new projects and providing the framing of what you think you might accomplish, I strongly suggest, like, don't set everything in stone, right? Have some well-outlined ideas of what you want to do, but then allow these community partnerships and relationships to kind of help mold the project and bring them, move them forward. Don't close doors preemptively that later you might need to go through, so to speak. And again, for all of this, I don't have easy answers for how to actually work through all this. Although I will share some of the mistakes I've made. Some other things to consider, whether you're starting something new or working with an ongoing project. First is funding and support. It's always worth postponing the launch of a project if taking that extra time is going to allow you to do some of the heavy lifting for long-term careful planning. The more work that you put in on the front end, the more successful you might be able to be in shopping it around to different supporters, right? I mean, it sounds like with this project, you have the mayor's ear, so hopefully, maybe the city. Past mayor. But within communities, be it city government, state and local government, and the National Endowment for the Humanities, tribal governments, local historical societies, there are lots of different groups that you can shop a project around to and start to cobble together, $100 here, $100 there, to provide some funding and support to get a project off the ground. The more donors you have, the more stakeholders you have, the more people you have literally invested in the project, but also then they're going to be more interested, engaged in participating and publicizing and everything thereafter. So I would say spend the time to plan carefully instead of jumping fully into something prematurely without the funding and support you might need to make it last long term. If you're here at the university, you might have access to servers and web domain spaces that you can use indefinitely for free. But if you're working outside of the university structure, you need to have someone at least for web hosting. One problem with digital history projects is there's a lot which have been really amazing, and then a faculty member at a university sets up in a really great project, and then they leave the university. And sometimes they're allowed to bring that project with them to work at their new institution. Sometimes they're not, and they lose access to maintaining the project. Sometimes projects just disappear. Or with a book, I guess a book could go out of print, but you can go to Amazon and find a used copy in general. But a digital project, if the hosting funding dries up, might just disappear. That's the last thing we want to have happen. I also think carefully about what kind of public and private entities are going to benefit from the project. Are there already adjacent, community organizations that have existing networks already out there, whose networks you can tap into for not just for funding or fundraising, but for publicizing the work and so forth. And I think there are, there's historical societies, there's kind of historical buff groups, people just like enthusiasts, show them how your project might serve. And then when you then later ask them either for funding or for help in publicizing, it's not that big of an ask because they already see like, oh, this is a project I'm excited about because my constituency is being served by it. And then, you can offer them some acknowledgements on the website saying this project is generously supported by, and they get their little shout out as well. It's out of those groups that you might start pulling some collaborators as well. Of course, this may get you into trouble of having too many cooks in the kitchen. Right? the more people that are involved, sometimes the spicier things can get in terms of trying to make decisions, right? But again, this is the challenge of listening and of community engagement. There's a need for continual engagement. When I publish a book, the book goes out there and the book is done, right? I might go give some book talks on it and engage with the public a little bit, talk to some students, but the work is done unless there's going to be a second edition or something. But lots of times with digital projects, they are never ending, which is great because they're constantly growing and evolving and getting, bigger and better. But that means that you need to be committed to long-term, not just funding, but long-term involvement of yourself and your collaborators. And if you're not set up, when your collaborator is not set up for a long-term project that's just going to go on constantly, then you might need to pivot and think about, well, if it's going to be a project that starts and then ends and has an end date, that's something you can plan for. Having continual engagement also requires you to be responsive to the public, and this is where things can get kind of the spiciest, perhaps. There's a Facebook group, a local history Facebook group where I live, that it wasn't great, and there was a lot of kind of weird posts and stuff, and so I thought maybe I'll start my own local history Facebook group, but set it up as a way where the public can ask questions, and then I try to convince all my local historian friends to also join the group. So when questions popped up that they knew something about, they could then provide answers. Like, I thought, that'd be valuable to the public. So I do that, I create it, and then this one guy started posting on my site or on this Facebook page, but just posting like multiple times a day. But it would be just like pictures of documents without any context. But some of it it was a lot of like mining history stuff. He was just wanting to share all the stuff that he had, which wasn't the purpose of this Facebook group. And so just the other day, I went and opened back up my Facebook Messenger, just remind myself of these discussions I had. Anyways, he used a lot of very colorful language as I politely said, hey, the purpose of this page is this. I appreciate your post, but maybe could you limit it to maybe one a week, because the page had basically just become like a casual user who maybe came up, oh, maybe this would be an interesting page for me to use. May scroll through and be like, it's just a bunch of random stuff that this one guy is posting. I didn't want the page to get overwhelmed with that. And he got really mad and swore at me a lot and threatened to get me fired. And he's like, I think you need to talk to your dean and make sure he knows what you're doing. Public engagement is messy. It's really messy, but we have to do it. We got to do it. We got to stay continually engaged. These are out of order a little bit. Sorry. Thinking about reach and publicity. If we're going to go do all this work, we need to be strategic about getting the word out, and also being strategic about when we get the word out. When I started my Mountain Histories project, which I'm going to transition to that in a second, I didn't do heavy publicity for a while because I didn't want to do a big publicity blitz and have people go to the project and there's nothing quite there yet because it was so young, So maybe wait till you kind of have things going. But you can leverage social media. You can leverage those community partners if you've already made collaborative relationships with them, and they have mailing lists or their own listservs or whatnot. Maybe they can help you spread the word and so forth. And as for risks and problems, I think we've actually already, I've already mentioned most of this. But again, to emphasize, I just already brought up earlier in the previous session as well about privacy, about the need to allow for community control of history and what kinds of stories are told and what is not told and shared, especially important in Indigenous communities, many of which have endured multiple generations of outsiders coming in and extracting local knowledge and then publishing it in ways that the community is uncomfortable with. Right? We can't engage in that. And again, sharing authority, having community partners is going to be key in helping us do that. Okay. How about a bad segue in transition? This kind of work is really hard because public history work is complex and messy because the public is complex and messy. Digital history work is hard because it never ends. It's just always ongoing. But it's so worth it because it has the potential to impact the public so much more than, these award-winning books that us historians try to write, Sometimes a ton of people read them, often not a ton of people read them. But with the Digital Public History Project, you have the opportunity to really impact the public in a large way, which is exciting. You guys, it sounded like, here, I need to pull up, where did the browser go? Leaflet, is that the, Leaflet was the one that you guys are using. There are, oh, this didn't change, sorry, I put this on the wrong screen. There we go. There's all kinds of different platforms that you can use for digital history projects. The one that my project is built on an open source thing called Omeka or Omeka. I haven't heard, no consensus on how to pronounce that. Some of these are free to download, just open source. You do have to have the technical knowledge, to how to download it all and install it on a server and get it up and running. But a lot of these are free to the public. My Intermountain Histories project is built in Curatescape, which uses Omeka. And you can download it for free and set up. Oh, look, there's me right there. But I mean, there are so many projects that are built on this one, and it's free. If you pay them, they will also develop a mobile app version, which we have as well. But that again requires you have some funding. There's a ton of other ones. Collection Builder does cost, but can be really powerful for. Oh, look at this interactive apps. This one apparently is also using Leaflet for kind of combination of mapping and having like archived catalogs of documents and stuff that people can open up, like a digital archive. Well, apparently ArcGIS doesn't like Chrome or whatever browser we're using. ArcGIS has a really great one called Story Maps, which, oh, maybe this is gonna, no, hold on. All right. Oh, wait, no, here we go, over you. And this is part of the ESRI software stuff. This costs, but really powerful for not just putting in for just, maps with pictures and stuff, but adding interpretation and analysis in dynamic ways. There's others, Pass It Down, Satori, Leaflet, all kinds of others. Lots of products out there, many of which are free to the public, just open source, some of which cost. So let me talk a little bit. What time do we have to end, by the way? I want
15 minutes, and we would like some Q&A.
Okay, let me go real quick. So this is the project that I run right now, Intermountain Histories, and I wanted to use some kind of digital platform to provide just, again, thinking about these, Facebook groups that are providing like just horrible history. How can I provide to the public easily accessible, quality historical information that they would find interesting? That was the first original goal. And I decided geographically that I was going to do the Intermountain West because I needed to put some kind of scope on the project. But then I had to ask, well, how am I going to write all these stories and do all this research? I can hire some student researchers and so forth. But pretty quickly I decided I'm going to make this a collaborative project. And so what I did is I reached out to professors all around the region. I wonder if it's backslash about. Let's hope so. Okay. Hey, it worked. Who teach in the region, to have them use this as an assignment in their classes. So they assign their students to research a small project. They go through some rounds of edits with them. and then they sent us all the materials. Originally, I was going to have them upload it to the back end of the website, and quickly realized that it was going to be hard enough for these professors to send me anything to begin with. So we do all the editing and uploading. But I made it a collaborative project instead of me and my students having to try to do all the research. This was powerful because it helped us to get the project up and running faster with more content, which the website is now blank. Oh, there we go. But it also gave us regional reach and automatic publicity and more stakeholders all around the region of people interested in the project and contributing. And it's been really powerful. It also shifted the focus of what I was thinking my public was, or who is this project serving? It's still serving the public, right? The public can go here, and each of these little dots is a different story, but some of them are organized into tours where there's, a set of 5 stories. This one here, Confederate markers in the Intermountain West, right? And you can go through and read each one of these individual stories. It's really great. And the public's going to benefit from that. But a potentially more important public that is being served by this project was the student who wrote it. This here, she was my intern when she did this. Now she's actually a research assistant project, Makoto Hunter, who now got to publish something under their own name. And she's now applying for grad schools, and I can't say where, but she's gotten some really exciting fully funded offers. And I'd like to think it's mostly because of this. Right now, it's not. It's because she's amazing. But the point being, this was giving students a chance to publish under their own name and start building their digital persona. So when future employers Google them, this shows up instead of pictures of something stupid they did in high school. Right. It also is I realized was a really unique and powerful pedagogical tool as well. Writing a this is a bad example because this one's really long. Writing a 300 to 500 word story that has a good hook, like someone reads it and they're gonna be hooked in, but does more than just like tell a nice story, but actually includes some analysis, includes bibliography of citations. Most of these have archival images and so forth. And doing that all in 300 to 500 words is so hard. And for students, it becomes a really important kind of writing assignment. They're writing not just for their professor, and you write a term paper for a professor and they read it and then no one ever sees it again. These students have to write something that their grandma might read and that the general public would be interested in reading. And it turns out that's maybe a lot easier to write a 2,000 word essay for your professor than a 300 word thing that's going to go up online forever. So the public that I'm serving has shifted somewhat from what I originally thought it was going to be. And I think actually the most important constituency I'm serving is the students who are getting to work on the project and publish and so forth. So that as an example kind of that need for flexibility. There are, maybe I'll just pause there. I had some other ideas of like some things I've stumbled with and not done well, but maybe some of them will come up in the Q&A.
Thank you, Dr. Rensink.
So that was an uninspiring conclusion. So big comments on like, this is amazing work, you get at it, you can do it,
Yeah, exactly. I know, some people might be asking, this is a Mapping Tahlequah History Workshop. Why aren't you bringing in someone from Tahlequah or such? Well, that is most of the sessions today, but the aspect with the keynote is to invite someone working on a similar project of another area to have that exchange, and see how they're thinking about the spaces, the areas that they delve into, and to be able to have, an outsider insight on the work we're doing. As you could tell, that's why a lot of his comments were some suggestions, ideas, what he's learned in the projects he's doing. So that was a key part of this annual workshop too, is inviting someone who has been doing projects, exemplary projects for us to learn from and have exchange with. Next year, as I mentioned, that some of you may have not been here, but we'll be hearing from Dr. Elizabeth Rule and Indigenous DC. Mapping Indigenous DC is her area of work, and she's from Chickasaw Nation, a citizen of Chickasaw. And so it's interesting, that connection will be fun. So these are really great opportunities to have more of a think tank conversations. And as Brenden said, we hope, to hear more of these suggestions, ideas you have in our interactions today and engagement. We do want to hear more questions or other comments that people have, and we're glad that you all feel comfortable when a question comes up of following up or something you'd like to ask. I can help, look at folks online too.
There's no questions yet.
Okay, well, I'll pull them up.
Dr. Rensink, I think you mentioned your work, the Joseph Smith papers. Is this something that you did?
Yeah, I was an editor with that project and a historian for that project for 2 years.
On that? I'm just curious.
Was that?
Can you comment briefly on that?
Yeah, I think the project is going for, I think maybe it ends in 2022.
It's not complete. It's not completed. It's not a book, right?
I mean, it's like 30 or 40 books. We published these documentary editing volumes, but then the documents are all on a website as well.
What website is this?
josephsmithpapers.org.
Okay, that's it.
Yeah, and it has archived and publicly available all of the documents. And then as the physical volumes have come out and been published, I think like 6 or 8 or 12 months after they're published, all of our historical analysis was then integrated onto the website. So if you pull up like a letter that someone wrote to Joseph Smith on a certain date, you can see the letter, read a transcript, and then read a historian's analysis.
Also, did you know that the Mormons were probably the first white Americans to specialize in irrigation in the West? They migrated down to Los Angeles, as you probably know, and took over the Los Angeles water apparatus.
Yeah.
Whatever it was.
Oh, fascinating. Great.
LA benefit.
Yeah. Well, certainly in this area, in all these spaces, I think it's interesting too of different populations, religious groups that come through. I mean, I'm still wanting to unpack in Tahlequah, there's stories of Mormons who came through here on the trail and built bricks. And some of that early houses that have bricks are from Mormons. I don't know. I've heard these stories and
there's a story to tell there.
Yeah. And I'm like, what? And Dr. Brad Agnew, whose work has been heavily influential, mentioned something about that as well, who has looked at this. So, you never know what these interesting connections are with different peoples and places that, as you mentioned, people know their history and stories, but sometimes the box gets pushed on, like in that kindergarten classroom or under a bed for whatever reason,
Mormons were incredibly influential in the development of the West, especially water works.
Yeah, and that's a main area of his work too. A question over here, Michael.
Yeah. A question for both of you, or all three of you. Are there any projects that you're working on at the moment that are not considered public?
Oh.
I mean, everything that everything I do as a scholar eventually is, to get published.
To be public too.
Be publicly accessible. I did for a couple of years. I was a consultant with the Native American Rights Fund, and I was working on a project for them, writing a history for a tribe that was going through the federal recognition process, and that's not public. I mean, I don't know how many thousands of words I wrote, and I'd love to publish it, but I don't know. The Native American Rights Fund owns it, and at this point, maybe they've transferred ownership of that material over to the tribe. I'm not sure, but generally, most of what we do at some point is public.
We do have a question online. Thank you, John. What is the Intermountain area in between Sierra Nevadas and Appalachia, like Appalachian?
Yeah, so
definition there.
So kind of, if we zoom in here, right? Like the Sierra Nevadas over to the Rockies-ish, right? That's the general. Now on the south side, maybe like the Mogollon Rim or the edge of the Colorado Plateau, and then the north, as the Rockies go.
Grand Canyon as well.
Yeah, so that's kind of along the periphery.
That's actually just, and I see you, Darren, I'll call on you next. And Joseph, did you have your hand up too? Okay, so a good follow-up on that. I'm glad they asked that because a question we've received several times is this only, the question of scope that you mentioned of having perimeters, how important that is, what kind of fluidity can you have? Because spaces can blur and blend. And so some people are wondering, are we only mapping Tahlequah history? What about Fort Gibson? What about Park Hill? Or what about other communities that have different linkage, and networks? What are your thoughts on that? As you've thought, I mean, you have a pretty large expanse here, and
Yeah.
how have you thought about that?
So that's a real challenge because by making the scope bigger, you can benefit from bringing in connecting disparate histories. It can be really interesting, but then also you may run the risk of losing focus. One issue I have is when you load up our website, or if you pull up the mobile app. Sorry, it's taking a minute to load. So this is how it loads right now, which I don't love because it has, in order to show all of the things, it has to zoom out kind of a little bit farther than I'd like. There actually are a number of stories which have been submitted and I haven't published because they were way too far out on the plains. And it just zoomed the initial landing page map out so far that it kind of becomes meaningless, right? Like if this is about the Intermountain West, but the map is almost the entire United States, right.
Yeah,
It kind of loses focus a little bit. So, but if you go too small, there might, the really fascinating or important historical narratives and stories that you want to dig through maybe transcend that boundary, and you're missing out then on what the real exciting stuff is. So that's, I don't know, there's no easy answer to that. It's something you have to wrestle with.
Okay. Darren had a question, then we'll hear from Joseph.
So you talked about like the files that were kind of forgotten. As you've worked on this project, I'm not sure exactly how long you've been working
that's a
on
good question.
the project itself.
4 years?
Okay, so I was just curious if there was any technology that had kind of gone by the wayside as you started, and you had to pick up something else because that was.
This is, and if you go back to some of the early digital history projects that were being done in the late 2000s into the 10, 15 years ago, some of them are built on platforms that that just like Flash animation, right?
Yeah.
Which doesn't really isn't a thing anymore, right? And now it's more like HTML5 and JavaScript. So this is a real.
Is it hard to update?
That's a problem. If you log into a certain software platform and that then goes out of date, what do? Some of the and this can cut both ways. But a lot of the stuff is open source, which has the chance then of the open source developers who've built it and made it available to the public are often really engaged in updating it. They have dedicated forum websites where you can ask Q&A for help, and they're often then always updating things. But also, if it was a passion project that someone made available to the public as open source, it may never get updated, right? Because they just don't have time. With Intermountain Histories, I was fortunate that the Red Center, we have funding. We have our own money. I didn't have to go fundraising. And I decided, well, let's capitalize on that. We paid for the most expensive option where they built us the mobile app and all that stuff. And if something breaks, the Curate Escape team fixes it for me, right? But I recognize that most institutions or individuals aren't privileged to have the kind of funding to do that continually. So I don't have a good answer. You need to be aware of is this this technology or this software, is this something that's it's gonna be a flash in the pan, some newfangled idea that someone thought was cool but isn't gonna have lasting power.
It's a similar issue with our archives we're working a lot with. They have VHS tapes, right? Mm-hmm. And all these other things. It's a big archival question too. And then all the work that needs to go into transferring that, resources, time, energy. So some of these projects might need to be rebuilt, to be honest, of how that dynamic goes. Joseph, you had a question?
It was time related, but just in the, you said 4 years you've been working on this. And you talked about the value of postponing if you need like heavy lifts that have to happen. Were there any major pitfalls that you wanted, that you guys are still struggling with 4 years in?
For me, it's just a workflow issue. I'm the bottleneck. So the more collaborating professors that I engage with, and the more students they have writing it, the more content comes on my desk every year. And I have a research editorial assistant every semester. But for me, that's the main issue. So and I was just thinking this summer, like I probably should do another round of recruit some new people.
Yeah.
And I was also like, I guess there's some people who did it for a couple semesters, really excited, and now they have different teaching assignments, so they haven't used it in class. So I need to get some new people on board. But I also run the risk of getting just drowning in too much stuff. Right. So again, the collaboration is so important, listening is so important, but you might drown in it. But I think it's worth it though, right? It's worth kind of wrestling with that.
Did you ever you mentioned advisory boards, did you ever consider sort of diversifying what you call bottleneck?
Yeah. So right now I call myself like the project manager and the general editor. And the reason that I gave myself 2 job titles wasn't just to like make myself sound more important, but I wanted the future possibility of dividing one of those sets of tasks off and maybe having someone else be the general editor, or maybe bring in a different faculty member somewhere to like do the editing, right? Right now, I'm still just running it all myself because I've been able to keep up, but yeah.
That's been a real issue for us.
Yeah, same thing.
Good idea.
Same thing, yeah. Was there a question back here? Yeah.
You said something that really caught my attention earlier about having both public and private things that are in this database, and that there were tribes that had said, for whatever reason, you've got sacred sites and places, but they're not going to be publicly listed. Could you talk a little bit more about that, and maybe about what they felt like the value was? Why did they feel like that was important to take part but not have it be public?
That was for let's see if I can go back here. That was this a project run by the American West Center up at the University of Utah called Native Places. And I think, and so I don't run this project, but I think that some of the tribes, they wanted to participate. So this is like where they're mapping all like the native place names, like in the native languages, right? For landscapes, mountains, rivers, and so forth. And I think there were some tribal communities who wanted to participate, and for their own kind of needs of archiving and recording history, there were lots of sacred sites or things that they wanted to map out for their community, but didn't want to make available to the public. So, even though maybe a lot of work was done and on the back end and all the data uploaded and everything, and the public never sees it, the tribe can now look at the back end and see that map and make use of it as needed. Or maybe in the future make some of the public, toggle it on their own.
Yeah.
So do you happen to know if they're using Mukutu?
Using what?
Mukutu. It's for a Drupal frame.
I'm not sure.
Have you heard of Mukutu?
Yeah. No, I think this is the one that they're using.
You think that is?
Yeah, Greg Smoke at the American West Center.
He's running.
He just spoke. We just had him give a talk with the Red Center. We just celebrated our 50th year anniversary last week.
Oh, yeah.
And so he came and gave a talk on public history stuff. And that kind of does ring a bell. So that might be the one that he's using, but it's Greg Smoke, SMOAK.
Who's the director?
You could email him and ask what they're using. On the back end of my site, which is built again in Omeka, there is a toggle. You can say, right now I think there's about 550 stories on the site, but on the back end, unpublished are another, 50 to 100 that I'm working on editing, or some that I'm just never going to publish because they weren't good, or maybe they're too far out of the geography, right? But there's a little private public toggle on that.
Oh, okay. And that's the point too. When we were saying ours is like a draft node, it's kind of that back end area. But and in the session on Cherokee landscapes and languages, I think Ia could talk more about the program he just mentioned, and we can talk more about that. All right. Well, we are at time, so let's give Brenden a hand. Thank you.